This video is for chapter 9 of the textbook, The Family. And this chapter focuses on families and children, particularly childbearing and parenting. So the chapter opens up by kind of considering the phrase start a family, because oftentimes, as Cohen notes, this phrase is used to refer to couples that are having their first child. And so the unspoken assumption of this phrase is that childless couples somehow add up to less than a family. And although we know from our very first chapter, when we talked about the definitions of family, both the official governmental definitions as well as the sociological definitions, we know that families take on many shapes and forms, but the persistence of this phrase does illustrate that, at least in popular perception, children remain a vital part of the cultural image of family life. The idea that children are what makes a family, if you will. And so the first part of this chapter is on childbearing. And so it opens by just kind of discussing some of the trends that we can see in the United States in regards to childbearing. So the first one has to do with size of families. Most American families have 1 to 3 children. And as the textbook notes, this is a much lower number than in the past. Family size has been in decline for most of the 20th century, apart from the baby boom period, which we discussed in chapter 2. And so a lot of that has to do with the changing role and the changing significance of children in both family life as well as like the larger kind of public sphere, larger society. And that comes up later on in this chapter. So I will discuss the changing significance of children a little later on in this presentation. But Cohen notes that outside of just this observation about the size of families, there is a much more complex story about family diversity. And so he kind of touches on several important changes and trends that we've seen. So the most important change, and one that has come up in previous chapters, is the fact that a number of parents have children outside of marriage. So whether that is children that are had before parents are married, or children that are born to parents who never go on and marry. There is this trend towards single motherhood, and he notes that this is a pretty generally recognized trend. So he also talks about some kind of maybe lesser recognized trends, like the fact that a majority of women who aren't married when they have their first child are in fact cohabiting with a male partner, which kind of speaks to the rising predominance of cohabitation as kind of a pathway to family formation. Another point he makes is that many children are involved with more than 2 parents. And that's because, of course, the number of parents who, marry or remarry or marry someone, besides their child's biological mother or father. So a growing number of families include step parents. The number of women reaching the age of 45 without having any children has doubled since the 1980s. But then also at the same time, more families are also having their first child at older ages, which also contributes to that increased smaller family sizes. And then the final point, just that there are more adults, both singles and couples, who are spending a larger proportion of their lives without children, whether that's because they don't have them, or whether because they have them late, or whether because people are living longer. So at some point, even if they have children, there is the possibility they might outlive their children, or at the very least, that they will that their children will move outside of the household. So in that sense, it's not that they don't have children, but they no longer have children in the household. So in this section, several important terms are introduced. Parent, an adult intimately responsible for the care and rearing of a child, and they distinguish between biological parents, the adults whose bodies produce the child, and adoptive parents, parents to a child that they did not produce biologically. And He does note that parents are not limited, obviously, to a mother father couple, as there is no correct number or gender specification for parents, right? So you can have same sex couples. You can have people that are in polyamorous, non monogamous relationships raising children. Just note that Cohen does make that observation here. Then he talks about fertility, which is the number of children born in a society or among a particular group. And particularly, he focuses on total fertility rate, the number of children born to the average woman in her lifetime. And he said, the total fertility rate is just useful for thinking about populations as a whole. Because, for one reason, we kind of pay close attention to a country's total fertility rate because uh, if that fertility rate is more than 2.1, the population is growing. But if it's lower than that, it will eventually start to shrink. And so, for people who study demography and look at, and compare across societies to kind of discuss, what phase of the demographic transition are different societies in, it is total fertility rate. That's one of the primary statistical, analyses that they're looking at. So, as noted, one of the more recognized trends is the growing number of unmarried parents. 40% of all children born in the United States are born to parents who aren't married, but single parenthood itself takes on many forms. There is kind of the stereotypical young adult single parent, which is the one I think that has the kind of um, greater cultural, prevalence, or predominance in people's minds, what people think of when they think of single parents. And so these are young adults who have children, either alone or they're partnered, but they are either not ready or not willing to marry. And it's worth noting that this group of single parents are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. However, some of this increase in single parenthood has come from a very different demographic. And that those people are older women who are single, but who decide who actively decide to have children as single parents. And Cohen talks about all the kind of factors that go into this. The idea that maybe they do not want to wait to get married, or they don't want to get married at all. And so they decide they want to become parents on their own, and they do this, either through adoption or using a sperm donor, or getting pregnant themselves using like alternative arrangements. And we'll talk about some of those later in this video. And so the families in these circumstances are less likely um, to be poor. They are much more likely to be economically advantaged. And then single parenthood, of course, can take the form of divorced people who had children, but then they got a divorce, and then they go on to not remarry. So all of these different demographics, these different groups will pop up, in these types of statistical figures as single parents. But hopefully Cohen, and this video makes it clear that despite sharing that single parent status, their economic realities and the situations that led to them being single parents can be very different. So keep that in mind, of course, when we start talking about, things related to like race and ethnicity, for instance. So we know that among American Indians, Blacks, and Puerto Rican families, half of all children are born to parents who are not married. Um, and so they have greater rates of single parents than other Latino sub-ethnicities, Asian and Pacific Islander ethnicities, as well as white non-Hispanics. There are also some differences in how many children members of major racial ethnic groups have. So if we are comparing just total fertility rates, the total fertility rates indicate that Latino women on average have just under 2 children, and this is the highest total fertility rate. And so there is this stereotype right around the size of Latino families, but oftentimes the stereotype is overstated. vastly overstated, right? But if you actually look at these total fertility rates, 1.96 for Latinas, 1.79 for Blacks, African Americans, 1.65 for American Indians, 1.64 for whites, 1.53 for Asians. The difference is not necessarily as dramatic, as pop culture or stereotypes, jokes would make you think. And part of the reason for this difference, in regards to Latinas versus other groups, has to do with the fact that a lot of Latinos are descended from recent immigrants, so they're first, second generations, and they come from countries that have higher fertility rates, where that's just more of a cultural norm. And then also groups with lower educations, once again, such as immigrants, especially immigrants that aren't coming, for specific educational or white collar job opportunities, they oftentimes have higher fertility rates as well. And so, another kind of factor that we can see that really plays into, when people have children, how many children people have, is education. The worldwide pattern is that women with lower levels of education have more children. And this is partly because women stop their education after they have children, or they postpone childbearing until they finish school. So what happens is if you start having children early, you postpone or stop your education, which leads to you usually just having less education and more children, versus if you wait until you finish education, particularly in countries where it has become more and more normative for women to pursue higher education and advanced education. You have children later, and thus you also have less children, just for fecundity, reasons, right? Right. You start having children at a later age, which leads to you having less children. Not to mention, women with higher education also risk giving up higher incomes and career statuses if they have children, or if they have a lot of children. And so this is known as the opportunity cost, or the price one pays for choosing the less lucrative of the available options. And so for this reason, women pursuing higher education, or women who have earned a higher education, they tend to wait to have children, and they tend to have smaller families. Um, Another kind of observation that Cohen just points out, though, is that if we only count women who had children when they fully intended to, then a lot of the education differences in the number of children, largely disappear. And that's because the high frequency of unintended births, especially among women or couples with less education or economic resources, partly results from their lack of access to good medical care. So, women who have more education also tend to have uh, better access to economic resources, which provides them better access to, medical care, that helps them with family planning, and making choices, informed choices, intentional choices about reproduction. So they're less likely to have unintended, to have surprise pregnancies, and unintended births in particular. So that also factors in. And the kind of other factor that your book focuses on is economic trends. And unsurprisingly, childbearing patterns do show people respond to their economic conditions, especially if you look at conscious birth planning. And so when people were facing the recession of the late 2000s, a lot of younger people deliberately postponed having children, because of that macro social, factor, the poor economy, and economic instability. Although, Cohen does note that this isn't a perfect correlation, because hard economic conditions don't always lead to lower birth rates, particularly among some kind of specific subgroups within society. And then also, it doesn't work the other way necessarily, because even as the economy improved, birth rates continued to fall. So it wasn't like the economy improved and birth rates, soared. It's not like we've had a repeat of the baby boom, even when we have had economic prosperity. So it just really seems like there is just this general trend, where more people are postponing parenthood for a variety of reasons. So, when we talk about postponing parenthood and not having children, one thing that I think that is helpful, a typology that I think is helpful, is to think about, there are multiple reasons why people can be childless. People who are postponing parenthood but fully intend to become parents at some point are what we call the temporarily childless, meaning at this moment they don't have children, but they fully intend to have children at some later date. And we'll talk more about why they are postponing parenthood here in a second. Two other childless groups that we're going to discuss later in this video is the involuntarily childless. This is primarily people who are suffering from infertility, and then the childless by choice, who we often refer to as child free. And we have a separate section on them as well. But let's talk now about this temporarily childless group, the people who are postponing parenthood. There is, like Cohen mentions, there is solid evidence that both men and women are postponing parenthood. And so the follow up question of why? Well, there are some macro level factors, like I mentioned, when we go through periods of economic instability, um, this impacts people's willingness to parent or parent at early ages. Another macro level factor is just kind of the shifting structure of the education and the labor market. The fact that more and more jobs are requiring a longer investment in individuals' own human capital, whether it is going to school, and getting an undergraduate degree and even a graduate degree, whether it is learning a trade. People are investing just longer amounts of time into their own personal development, and they're making the decision to refrain from having families until that point. Certainly, there has also been kind of this cultural shift where people, particularly if they are actively engaging in family planning, they are waiting for what they feel like is a good moment, and oftentimes that involves, their marriage being in a good place, their financial standing being in a good place, and even home ownership, and home and with different. Uh, Cities and states kind of having housing crisis and issues around being able to afford a home and having available homes to people who have a range of incomes. This has certainly led to people uh, um, postponing parenthood. Um, One macro level factor that doesn't seem to so much as encourage postponing parenthood as much as it seems to encourage parenthood is, of course, military skirmishes. And certainly we do know that one group of people that do not have kind of abstained from this postponing parenthood trend are the young people who are in the military, who get married while being in the military. They're less likely to postpone. And then there are micro level factors. And you might have seen this in articles where people talk about the millennials, or even millennials in particular, because Gen Z is still in most cases still too young. But this idea that this generation prioritizes freedom over responsibility, that they prioritize flexibility, that they prioritize uh, you know um, individuality, and they're much more interested in things like travel and self-development than previous generations. And you can just kind of see that some of those qualities and some of those desires just don't align well with parenthood. That doesn't mean that they never plan on becoming parents. It just means that they are in a lot of cases planning on becoming older parents. And there are advantages to waiting to parent at an older age. Like I said, oftentimes, if you are married or partnered, your relationship is more stable, that you have greater economic stability, and that translates into increased economic resources that will benefit your child. But there are disadvantages. Just because people are living longer doesn't mean we're living forever. So, of course, this does impact the amount of time that people get to spend with their children, the decreased number of grandparents and great grandparents. These are trends that we're starting to see, and then of course some of these people who wait to have children, thinking that they're going to be temporarily childless, they might find themselves becoming the involuntarily childless, meaning that certainly fecundity, if fertility is how many children you have, fecundity is how many, your potential to have children. And so we do know that along with age comes impaired fecundity, for both men and women, but particularly, of course, for women. So the longer you wait to have children, of course, the greater the risk that when you are finally ready, emotionally, financially, that unfortunately at that point physically you might not be able to. And so that brings us to the second part of chapter 9, which is focused on adoption. Because besides having your own children, being bearing your own child, another way, of course, of becoming a parent is through adoption. And your book does note that adoption was and still remains an option for parents who are unable or unwilling to raise their own biological children. But I also will add to that, adoption also is just an option for people who want to raise children, that aren't their biological children, even if they have their own biological children. So think about I have three photos there from three different TV shows, that kind of had adoption storylines. But in the case of the Pearsons from This Is Us, you see Randall pictured there, and in the case of Meredith Grey from Grey's Anatomy, they adopted children, but they also had their own biological children. So I just want to clarify that, because the way that point is worded by Cohen, it kind of makes it seem like people can't be both adoptive parents and biological parents at the same time. And that's not true. But certainly, one important observation to make is that adoption is a lot more common. Or adoption used to be more common and more secretive before the 1960s. And we'll talk about the secretive on the next slide. But let's talk about the commonality of adoption. It became less common beginning around the 1930s, and then certainly became less common by the time we hit the 1960s and 70s. And that's because the decline of the stigma of the unwed mother, the which led to a lot of women, that stigma of being an unwed mother led to a lot of women giving up their children, giving up babies. um, and then of course after the 1930s we also have the growing availability, as well as just the growing efficiency of birth control, not just barrier methods, but of course the hormonal pill, which we've talked about in this class in a previous chapter. And then finally the legality of abortion, and I have a whole section on abortion, so we'll save that discussion for that. So all of these factors basically just led to the fact that women who are not willing or able to become parents were just less likely to have children as a result, right? They either just did not become pregnant, or they had an abortion, and if they did become pregnant, or in the case of the decline in the stigma, they kept their child, if they so wanted. So today, only approximately 2.1% of all US children are adopted. Um, as noted, adoption is less secretive than it was before. Before the 1960s, a lot of adoptions are what we would have called closed adoptions. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide. And in a lot of cases, sometimes families were not even very open with children that they were in fact adopted. But now the textbook notes that almost all adopted children now know that they live in an adoptive family. And part of that just kind of corresponds to a shift um, in psychologists and family therapists in terms of what they suggest to adoptive parents, which is making sure that your adopted child knows the truth. That it's important that they know the truth. Um, and so your book talks about how adoption today can be divided into three categories: private services, public agencies, and international adoptions. And we'll talk a little bit more about international adoptions. But now let's just kind of focus on some of the controversies that have come up about adoption in this country. So, one thing that I noted is that a lot more adoptions have become more open versus closed. So a closed adoption was really an adoption with sealed records, right? It limited the ability of the child who was adopted to find out anything about their birth parents. The records were sealed and closed off from them. Open adoptions are, the information is readily available, and in some cases, the adoptive family even keeps in touch with the birth mother, in less circumstances, perhaps the birth father, and they encourage a relationship between the adopted child and their birth parents. In between these two options is semi-open, which is kind of become the more normative option today, which is why Cohen notes that a lot of adopted children have some access to some information about their birth parents. And with semi-open, it means that although there might not be a personal relationship between the adoptive family and adopted child and the birth family, or like I said, particularly the birth mother, oftentimes some records are made available. And part of why we have had this kind of transition towards being semi-open versus closed is because of increased medical knowledge around the genetic links and risk of so many diseases, and the fact that it's just considered important for children to kind of know, if at all possible, to kind of know about the health histories of their birth parents. And so, unlike closed adoptions where all that information was sealed off from them, semi-open adoptions, you at least have some access to some of this information and records. When I do this in class, I allow students to kind of argue, their arguments for and against, open, closed, semi-open. But just kind of think about what maybe if you the stance you would take if you were a birth parent versus an adoptive parent versus the adopted child yourself. What would be the advantages and disadvantages of all these different types. Another adoption controversy is transracial adoptions. Um, and it's worth noting that a good amount of this debate has also risen out of the fact that a lot of transracial adoptions also occur within the context of foster children who are in the foster system and whose parents at some point relinquish their parental rights. Um, and once again, this just kind of reflects a how should I say this? This kind of just reflects a misalignment in the foster care adoption market and the available children. So a lot of families interested in adoption, or whether it's adopting children, through public agencies like foster children or private agencies, a lot of those families tend to be white. A lot of the children do not tend to be white. They are, particularly if you're talking about children who are being adopted out of the foster system, they tend to be minority children, particularly African American, as well as Native American, and as well as some uh, Latino sub-ethnicities. And so there were concerns about, do we allow parents of a different race to adopt children who are who who are minority? Do we allow non-minority parents to adopt minority children? And there was this concern, as particularly in regards to Black children, raised by the National Association of Black Social Workers, where they were really just concerned about if white parents had the ability to socialize Black children with kind of necessary kind of cultural knowledge, and giving them kind of a sense of culture and history, that can be really important in a society where you are a minority who experiences, systematic discrimination and racism. And so, kind of in response to those types of concerns, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act of 1994 was passed, and then later the Interethnic Adoption Provision of 1996 was passed. And both of them are federal laws that govern how foster and adoption placement decisions involving race, color, or national origin are considered. And you can look up both of those acts if you want more details. But the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act just puts some policies in place to make sure that 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 children who are placed in a household where the parents are of a different race, that they have kind of been appropriately screened, that the person handling the adoption is confident about their ability to provide necessary kind of cultural resources, that they have kind of have what is called cultural competency. But then at the same time, the interethnic adoption provision of 1996 I don't want to say it was an amendment of that act, but it was an addition that made sure that children weren't languishing in the system just because a household that aligned with their race and ethnicity, could not be found, right? So the idea behind the IEP is that children, it is better to be in a household where the parents are not the same race as the child than to just kind of be in the system, generally speaking. Another kind of controversy that's come up in the realm of adoption is adoption by same-sex parents. And this used to be a lot more complicated before 2015, when Obergefell v. Hodges was passed, and we were able to constitutionally protect same-sex marriage in all states. Because before that, it led to same-sex partners, if they were in a state where they were not able to be legally married, they would have to kind of approach adoption through this, more confusing and expensive and more paperwork and bureaucratic process called joint adoption, where basically, because they weren't legally married, they had to adopt the same child as separate individuals. Which, if that sounds confusing, it was, because it definitely led to issues when there were any type of breakups or separations. Um, since Obergefell v. Hodges, the number of same-sex parents who adopt has increased in the United States, even more so. And your textbook kind of provides that statistic that same-sex parents in the United States are 4 times more likely than different sex parents to be raising an adopted child. And part of that just kind of reflects, particularly if you're talking about like gay men, couples, part of that just kind of reflects, the much more expensive and much more difficult process of trying to use assisted reproductive technologies to have a child of their own, a child that has some type of biological tie to one of them. Adoption is now much more kind of straightforward and streamlined process. You have a video that talks about the kind of controversies around same-sex partner adoption. So if you haven't looked at that video, I encourage you to look at that and consider some of the arguments that people offer for it versus against it. Just know in terms of, which arguments have the greater credibility. We'll talk about this more when we get to the section on same-sex parenting. But really, the arguments against same-sex partner adoption are really rooted in stereotypes and prejudices against same-sex relationships and the idea of same-sex parenting, and a lot of that has not been empirically substantiated, by most researchers. The final adoption controversy has to do with international adoptions, which your textbook notes there has been a decrease. So let's just kind of consider that for a second. So this figure shows the number of children adopted into the United States from other countries from 1990 to 2018. You can see that there was a peak in 2004, and then there's been a steady decline. And part of this has to do with the fact that international adoption is complicated, it's expensive, it can be controversial. Your book notes that there are many legal and cultural difficulties and considerations. And because of concerns about international adoption, the Hague Adoption Convention was a international agreement that tried to facilitate adoptions in the interest of these children, to make sure that children weren't being trafficked, to kind of make sure that someone was looking out for the best interest of these children. And so that also kind of contributed to the decline. um, um, International adoption, while still an option, has become a less preferred, less accessible option than even 15 years ago. So the third section of the book considers people who do not have children, and so we're returning to that childless typology, and we're going to talk about people who, the involuntarily childless, and then the voluntarily childless. Your textbook kind of opens this discussion by just kind of noting that the reasons individuals decide to have or not have children are many and varied, and there can be both conscious and unconscious factors, and that uh, part of why we've seen an increase in these numbers of people has to do with the fact that in modern society, children are a large expense. And they are considered valuable more for symbolic and emotional reasons than for economic ones, because in pre-industrial families, of course, people had children and many children because of their labor. A lot of people lived on farms, they were part of the agricultural sector, and your children were pretty much your workforce. And also, your book notes that at this time there weren't a lot of governmental programs like Social Security or Medicare, or Medicaid that were going to help out elderly people as they got older. So children were a form of social insurance, right? You had enough of them, at least one or two are going to be successful and willing to take care of mom and dad in their old age. Now, of course, there are safety net programs. So all of this just kind of leads to the fact that people, a lot of people still may want to have children, but because people don't necessarily need to have children, that has certainly encouraged some people to opt out, right? To say, hey, I don't want to have children. But then also, for everyone, this is not always a deliberate choice. For some people, it may just be a matter of biology. Not being able to have them, and for some people, it might just be a matter of circumstances. That missing that period of fertility, fecundity, and then not having the opportunity to have children, so they move from being temporarily childless to voluntarily, involuntarily childless. So one way in which a person doesn't become a parent, of course, that is controversial in society, is abortion. And so abortion is the expulsion of an embryo or fetus from the uterus. it can occur naturally, and the term for that is spontaneous abortion. But because I think of the stigma around the word abortion, we usually use the term miscarriage if it happens naturally. Or, of course, an abortion can be induced medically, surgically, but also, in the last decade and a half or so, it's also become more common to have abortions via pill pharmaceutically. And women have a constitutional right to pursue an abortion, to have an abortion, and that was established in the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade in 1973. Although, as your textbook notes, despite this ruling, abortion remains a very divisive issue in American politics, and there are always ongoing legal challenges, particularly in conservative states, making people question, if such a case was to go in front of a Supreme Court, a more conservative Supreme Court, will this constitutional right, necessarily still exist? And this doesn't just impact, a handful of women. It's worth noting that about one third of American women will have an abortion by the age of 45. Now, if you're focused more on recent years, we do know that the abortion rate has declined. And that's because, of course, a lot of that, of course, is due to the Affordable Care Act that increased uh, women's access to primary care, including access to low cost slash free hormonal birth control or long term birth control, which has dramatically, of course, impacted the number of people who experience unintended and unwanted pregnancies, and thus no not needing to seek out an abortion. Um, Looking at the data from 2017, there were 900,000 abortions performed in the United States. Of those, 92% take place in the first trimester of pregnancy. And I always think that's important to note because, especially for a lot of people who engage in pro life rhetoric, um, some of the more horrific images and language that they use comes from late term abortions or later term abortions, which is just worth noting. A lot of those abortions are less by choice and more because of medical necessity due to either danger or harm to the mother or to the child. For a lot of women, if they have an abortion, it does happen in that first trimester, so those first 12 weeks. The reasons for terminating a pregnancy, as your book notes, can be very complicated. Um, and although some people do terminate because of medical reasons, like I said, especially if they fall in that 8% that happen outside of the first trimester, for a lot of women, particularly those having, uh, those early trimester, first trimester abortions, the reasons are less medical and they're more likely to be based on economics, education, or other family concerns. Unsurprisingly, women who are most likely to have abortions are those who are most likely to have unintended pregnancies. Just meaning, that a lot of the economic, educational factors that contribute or that are correlated to unintended pregnancies, we see a lot of those same type of correlates with abortions. Although it's worth noting that some of this also can vary. So this is a little dated. It's 2008, or well, it was produced in 2013, but it's using old data. But I like to use it because it kind of makes that point, right? That people that have the higher unintended pregnancy rates are going to also have the higher abortion rates because the pregnancy wasn't planned. Um, but then also, even those who then go on to have the child, right, they have higher unplanned birth rates, which means they're bringing children into situations where they perhaps are at least less economically stable, perhaps their relationships are not as strong or as solid. um But a lot of these racial ethnic disparities in reproductive health outcomes just reflect the broader social and economic disparities, differences in education, differences in employment and benefits associated with certain types of employment, differences in income. And like I said, especially, for this data, which predated the Affordable Care Act, a lot of this also had to do with access to health care, access to primary care and kind of your basic um, OBGYN, type of services and appointments that have to do with family planning. Although this is not discussed by your book, I like to throw this in as a caveat as well, because in some cases we do have people who they become a parent, but they don't necessarily remain a parent for very long. Uh, Um, and that's because comparative to other fully industrialized countries, America has had a high infant mortality and even child mortality rate. So, infant mortality rate is the number of babies under 1 year of age who die per 1,000 live births. So, key here is live births. So, this is not abortions. This is not babies who are, this is not stillbirths. This refers to children who are born but who die before even reaching the age of one. And so you can see that on the right hand side, or I guess maybe that's the left hand side of that first graph, and you can see that the United States, even though our infant mortality rate has declined from the 1960s and 1970s into 2010, we still remain higher than our kind of comparison countries. The OECD 19, as they note, is a group of 19 developed nations in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So this is a lot of our European nations. It's like, it's Canada. It's like some of the larger Asian nations like China. So we have a high infant mortality rate. And, once again, there are some racial ethnic disparities. A lot of this, of course, has a lot to do with the level and quality of prenatal care received, but then also the level of care and follow up, received by both mother and child after the birth, as well as the living conditions, right? Which is why it's unsurprising that some of our highest IMR occurs in racial ethnic groups where you also have high rates of poverty. Um, and although I'm not going to focus on child mortality, it's just worth noting, in a country kind of plagued by violence, gun violence in particular, unsurprisingly, there are plenty of people who do become a parent, but their children do not necessarily live to become adults themselves. And when once again, although our rate has gone down um, between 1960 and 2010, it still is higher than other comparison countries. So now let's switch to people who don't have children but wanted them. This is that involuntarily childless type. And so these are couples that fail to have a successful pregnancy despite deliberately having sex without contraception in order to get pregnant. That's the definition of infertility. So, given this general definition, that's approximately about 9% of couples around the world. And in the United States, we have a slightly lower rate of 7%. Um, and that's the usual definition of infertility, without having like a specific cause or medical diagnosis. And infertility can have many potential causes. I've already kind of discussed older age, poor overall health, obesity, smoking, a history of sexually transmitted infections. Um, and so like so many other things, there is a strong correlate to lower education and lower income. Um, so patterns of infertility are consistent with other kinds of inequality. And so uh, based upon that, women with higher levels of education tend to have lower rates of infertility. White women tend to be least likely to experience infertility. In the past, women were blamed for infertility more than men. However, we now know that male and female medical conditions are equally likely to be the cause of infertility for a couple. Research suggests that the men in couples account for about 40% of infertility problems, and the females account for about 40%. And then there's about 20% that they call idiopathic infertility, meaning doctors really aren't sure why couples aren't able to have a baby, they just are. Um, Infertility is now considered to be a treatable problem because of medical research and a shift in cultural attitudes. But, once again, a lot of those treatments are more invasive to women than to men. So even though women aren't necessarily being blamed for being infertile, like in the past, in some ways, that additional burden of if a couple is infertile, an additional burden still just tends to fall upon the women. So, what are the medical options for infertility? Your book talks about several. I am not a doctor, and I want to be very careful that I don't say something incorrect or wrong. So, I'm not going to add a lot of additional information here. So, I strongly encourage you to just kind of read these pages of your book. But there's fertility drugs, there's surrogacy, there's artificial insemination, where you can either use the semen of a partner, or someone or even a private anonymous donor. There's assisted reproductive technology that just kind of refers broadly to all procedures that involve handling of human eggs and sperm to establish a pregnancy. So it is handling, doing this process outside of the womb itself. And it's assisted reproductive technology. That was actually Cohen's trend to watch for this chapter. And he does provide a little bit more information about it, as well as, it's kind of the growing interest in it, the associated cost, some of the controversies that can kind of go along with it, especially in regards to like genetic selection, the idea that it can allow people to produce a child with traits that the parents choose, the so-called designer babies, and people sometimes feel very uncomfortable with that. The final part of this section is the voluntarily childless. And oftentimes, if you're voluntarily childless, instead of using childless, we use the term child free, right? Because it kind of reflects a choice, a choice that was made. And although all types of people can be child free, certainly one kind of demographic who has captured cultural pop culture's attention are the group that we call dinks, double income no kids. And this trend is strong among this group because these are usually women with higher education and professional careers, who marry, and they tend to marry other people of they marry within their socioeconomic class. So they marry men with higher education and professional careers. So they wind up having a lot of economic resources. And traditionally, these are the types of people that were like, oh yes, you're definitely going to go on and you're going to use these economic resources to have babies and raise children. But they're like, no, thank you. And so, the Time magazine that kind of pictures them on, what appears to be a beach in bathing suits. They look all relaxed and in great shape. The implication is this type of family is growing in prevalence. But Cohen does note that child free has spread beyond that group. And families without children by choice is just another type of family arrangement in modern society. And this is about 15% of American adults live without children in this country. Sorry, I had to cough there. As as the textbook notes, part of this phenomenon has been attributed to a backlash against the culture of intensive parenting and the rise of modern individualism, right? People not wanting to pour all of their time and energy and financial resources into their children. And like I said, When I was discussing postponing children, for people who ultimately decide to just not have them, it's making a decision that they value kind of another path and another lifestyle than the one that kind of comes along with being a parent. And but your textbook notes, even though it's becoming more acceptable, people who decide not to have children are still in the minority. That does mean that this particular choice often requires reasoning and justification to others, right? People, ask people, when are you going to have a kid? Don't you want to have a kid? Aren't you going to regret not having a kid? Not saying that people should ask these questions, just saying that despite this becoming a more common choice, it is still considered to not be normative. And so your book just makes the point that there has become a steady rise in the number and proportion of U.S. adults without children. Um, and part of this has to do with the fact that they're marrying later. Part of this has to do with the fact that they're postponing having children. And of course, some of this just means that some people just choose not to have children at all. And so this brings up the first article that I'm suggesting that you read, which is really just kind of an exploration about why a growing number of women are saying no to parenthood. And it comes from USA Today, which brings us to, I'm going to temporarily skip section 9.4. I'm not skipping it. I just kind of I'm going to talk about it in a different order. I'm going to talk about 9.5 first, which is parenting. So after talking about all the people who, chose not to have to become a parent, or, wound up not becoming a parent for whatever reason, let's now talk about parenting. People who do raise children, which, that is the definition of parenting that your book provides. The activity of raising a child. So one thing is worth noting is that parenting is not necessarily innate or instinctive. So it doesn't come naturally, human parenting. It is something that people have to learn, and it raises questions about, how do you learn, how do you learn to be a parent? Well, as someone who's not a parent, what I can say is that research suggests this is a very hard role to prepare for. Even if you are anticipating becoming a parent, you are, your pregnancy, your child's birth is planned and intentional. It's still very hard to prepare to be a parent until you are a parent. And that's because parental roles are described as being, as being defined by their irreversibility, meaning, once you are a parent, you are always a parent. You can't take it back and say, hey, I don't want to be a parent anymore. Even if you give your child up for adoption, right? That status of being a parent, is not one that you can necessarily just say, hey, I changed my mind. And you certainly can't say that easily. Um, Lack of preparation, because you really can't prepare to be a parent until you are one. Um, Unless of course you took on a very parenting like role with siblings. Idealization and romanticization. In our culture, there are a lot of ideals and romantic ideals about what it means to be a parent. You'll feel this bond, you'll feel so much love, you're going to be so good at it and great at it. And of course, this is oftentimes not the case. Suddenness, right? You have a baby and all of a sudden now you're a parent. Up until the point where you have a baby, and particularly this can be the case for fathers because they don't have the experience of pregnancy in the same way. But now all of a sudden you're in this role. And then of course role conflict, because you now are adding this role that in a lot of ways is all encompassing, is going to change your life dramatically. And in modern society, being a parent is just one of several roles that you will have, which means that it will then be in conflict with other roles you might have. And so that leaves me to like three concepts from sociology that I want you to know in regards to parenting. So the first one is role conflict, and I couldn't find an image related to parents, so you're going to have to like just accept my image related to students. So role conflict is when you have multiple roles, and those multiple roles come with multiple obligations and expectations, leading to you having to make choices about which obligations and expectations to uphold, which ones do you do well, which ones do you not do well, which ones do you put on the back burner, which ones do you, make your primary. And so your roles are in conflict with one another. So you can just imagine for a parent, you also are still you potentially are also still a spouse. You might be someone's employee. There are these other roles that you have, but now you also are a parent, and parent is supposed to be a primary role, and it comes with so many expectations and obligations, and those expectations and obligations can be in conflict with your other obligations for your other roles, like spending quality time with your spouse, or doing a good job at work, or staying late for work, or traveling for work. So all of that's role conflict. Role strain is when you have one specific role, but it has competing obligations, making it hard to do the role well because the obligations themselves lead, are competing, creating strain. Because if you do one obligation well, then you won't do the other obligation well, and so it leads to a stressful situation. So with parents, think about it. You are supposed to have this loving, trusting, relationship with your child. You're supposed to be like a friend, someone, a confidant. But at the same time, you have to be this authority figure, this disciplinarian that teaches them discipline, and has to enforce the hard lessons. You're both friend and enforcer. Those are competing obligations. And it's going to create a strain because you're going to have situations where you're going to constantly have to make decisions about, how strict do I need to be? But if I'm too strict, my child won't come to me and talk to me honestly and openly. So that's role strain. And then finally is role overload. Before I get to role overload, let me just say, um, that four kind of contributing factors to role strain, particularly for parents, is unrealistic role expectations, right? Just all the things that kind of go into, being a parent. Like I said, friend and enforcer and protector and provider. The other kind of issue with role strain is that, like, societally, we've had this historical shift where parents have decreased authority in their private sphere comparative to previous times. I mean, there are some policies and laws regarding, your child's rights, and as well as policies about, drawing a line, a distinction between like discipline and abuse. And at the same time, there's decreased authority. There are now increased responsibilities, about what we expect people to provide to their children, especially now with the kind of shifting significance of children in society, where we see them more as investments than, like, your own little private, workforce. We'll talk about this later in this video, but what it means to be a good parent now, has shifted. And there are, that fourth point, a lot more high parenting standards. And so, both role conflict and role strain contribute to this third type, or this third concept that I want you to know in regards to parenting, which is role overload. And this is what happens when, people have multiple roles, and these roles have multiple obligations, and they just don't have the necessary resources, time, energy, finances to be able to perform them. And so it is basically an outcome of role conflict and role strain. And so your book kind of talks about, what do we expect from parents? Like, what are they supposed to do? And they talk about the three broad categories of skills and resources, that parents are supposed to offer their children. And this comes straight from your book, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. So make sure you read that section carefully. But it has to do with socialization, social bonds, and social networks. Right. Those are the broad categories that you're supposed to provide your child. But obviously, that's just a drop in a bucket. That doesn't begin to answer the question, what does it mean to be a good parent? So, to answer that question, let's first consider two trends. The first trend being the meaning of childhood. So, I've already said that children have become fewer and more precious. they've lost their economic value, and they've achieved a newfound emotional value, right? So that's why they're the priceless child. But what's crazy is, while the child might be priceless, childhood, as Cohen notes, is very expensive. And he talks about the amount of money that, a typical family will spend on their children. And so the meaning of childhood has changed, but then also parental insecurity about raising children has grown. Because you have fewer children, their investment in each one has grown. And so there are all these concerns that parents today have about economic insecurities, about crime, about making, providing opportunities and pathways to, a better life. um, uh, and a lot of these types of parenting concerns, it's not that people in the past didn't care about their children, but that level of parental insecurity just wasn't nearly as high 30, 40 years ago as it is now. And as well as the fact that, certainly if you go back 40, 56 years ago, how people saw and perceived children has also shifted. So all of this, of course, just means that the answer to that question, what does it mean to be a good parent, is now become harder to answer. One way you can answer that, and certainly this might be the way that you would answer that if you were coming to this question from a psychological background, is to talk about the four common parenting styles, because this is where we get this typology. It's from psychology. And so it's basically, a typology based around how low or high a parent is in two kind of specific traits. One of them is parental support, right? And so, if you go back to my rural strain example, this is that whole, like, being their friend, being their confidant, being someone that they can turn to without fear or judgment. And then the other kind of characteristic is parental control. And so this is the other expectation that I discussed, when talking about role strain, and that's being the enforcer, being the person that teaches, discipline, that is the authority figure. So how high or low a parent is, um, in for each of these characteristics, results in a typology being formed. And so if a parent is low in parental support and high in parental control, we call them authoritarian parent. This parent doesn't necessarily give out a lot of love. They might be hard to approach. Their child might be more scared of them, and they're very strict. They have rules that they enforce. They are strict disciplinarians. Opposite of that parent is the permissive parent. This parent is like their child's best friend. The child oftentimes, feels very comfortable talking to them, disclosing information to them that perhaps the child of an authoritarian parent would be, afraid to do. But on the negative side, there is low parental control. This parent does not enforce rules. They don't they haven't established a lot of discipline in their household. And so, depending on the child, they might take a lot of advantage of that. They might engage in, high risk behaviors because they aren't necessarily afraid of getting caught, and they don't fear any consequences. The uninvolved parent is low in both. They don't enforce any rules, but they also don't provide a lot of love and support. Uninvolved parent is largely absent. If they're physically there, they're not emotionally there. They're not invested in their child. But then, they also might just not very physically be there, right? They might be, out focused on their own life, not providing their child with either support or control. And then the opposite of that, and this is the one that psychologists have tended to push as being the ideal, is a parent who provides both high parental support and high parental control. The idea that they support their child, that they make it clear that they love them, unconditional love, that they trust them, but at the same time that they have boundaries that they enforce, that they have rules that they enforce, right? That they do provide some sense of control and stability, because psychologists note children do need that. Now, beyond that broad typology, a lot of our other ideas are that, in cult in yeah, in society come from consumer culture, which sells parenting advice. And the number of these books, if you go to that section of the bookstore, it once again just kind of reflects that insecurity that modern parents have around parenting, because there are so many books about how to raise your child. And that's because, like I said, this idea of wanting to be a good parent, and that the standards of what it means to be a good parent have increased, means that this generation of parents is just much more invested in this idea, than previous parents, or previous generations. And so your book notes that when it comes to children's success and being happy and well adjusted, doing well in school and staying out of serious trouble, some aspects of parenting have been proven beneficial when we look at the kind of empirical evidence. Number one is supportiveness, right? Spending time with your child, being accessible. Um, Two is monitoring. Useful rule setting creates an environment for healthy development. And then discipline. When used in a consistent and proportional way, discipline helps develop a sense of security in children. So, in some ways, obviously, supportiveness relates to the support characteristic from the typology, and the monitoring and discipline both relate to the control. Um, your book says, children have to learn discipline because self control is not innate. If you've ever been in a room full of a bunch of 2 and 3 year olds, you know this, right? They're like a bunch of little wild animals. I mean, a group of 18-month-olds are not very different from a group of puppies in the sense that they have not learned self control yet. So, certainly in America, one thing that has been controversial is when we're talking about discipline, and what do we mean by how do you enact discipline, how do you punish? And so one thing that we've seen is a distinction, between people who espouse verbal punishment versus people who espouse corporal punishment, right? Bodily physical punishment. And we are learning more and more that spanking is harmful and not as effective as previously thought in terms of establishing discipline. And so we certainly see among higher income, and more highly educated people a shift away from corporal punishment. But as you can see, the number of people who still just kind of agree, with the idea that spanking is effective, or can be effective, is still relatively, even though it's decreased, is still relatively high. And once again, this is not there. There are some significant global distinctions, in how different countries, society, country citizens kind of view corporal punishment. So now let's kind of add a gendered lens here, because we've been talking about what makes a good parent, but now let's consider sociologically, the distinction between what makes a good mom versus a good dad. So your book talks about, especially with mothers, the ideology of intensive motherhood, and it comes from sociologist Sharon Hayes, and she wrote about it in her book, The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. And it's basically the cultural pressure on women to devote more time and energy and money to raising their children. Um, and she said that a lot of this cultural pressure increased as employment rates for women increased, meaning people could be almost less invested mothers when they were stay at home mothers, because culturally that was seen as them doing the right thing. But as more and more women moved into the labor force, there was almost this cultural blowback where the stakes of what it meant to be a good mother got dramatically increased. And so research has found that, in response to this pressure, women's priorities have changed, and they are spending more time with their children, and that they are doing this by basically spending less time on other things, particularly like leisure and adult recreational activities, i.e., having their own lives, and particularly for women, they by sleeping less, which of course is concerning. And so going along with this change in parental expectations, it's kind of gone hand in hand with changes just in attitudes towards parenting in general. And so, this relates back to our previous discussion about concerted cultivation, because concerted cultivation kind of goes hand in hand with intensive motherhood. A lot of the elements of concerted cultivation require a lot of time, energy, and financial investment from both parents. But particularly in most families, like I said, the burden oftentimes falls more so on the mother. And as your book notes, I mean, this cultural pressure is, it creates unnecessary stress for all mothers. But then there are just some mothers who are unable to live up to these cultural expectations because they don't have the time, they don't have the money, to be able to engage in that intensive, type of investment. So, what makes a good dad? Well, your book talks about how historically, a lot of research focused on mothers. So, research on fathers has been limited and has only really grown in the last few decades. And part of this really just aligns with the fact that there has been this shift in attitudes about what makes a good father. And so, your book talks about how we've shifted from the ideal of the father as a male provider to the ideal of the father as an involved father. The male provider ideal, this is that kind of old stereotype, right, where all the dad really has to do is go to work, make money, keep a roof over their head, keep the kids fed. The involved father ideal is the idea that the father is an emotional nurturing companion who bonds with his children as well as providing for him. And your book notes that the involved father ideal has become nearly universally accepted, and most new fathers today embrace it completely. And so, this shifting attitude has translated to measurable changes in parenting. And I give you some more information about both ideals, which, because my voice is starting to give out and this video is getting a little long, I'm just going to encourage you to read this text heavy slide on your own. But what did I just say? The shifts in attitudes has created a shift in behaviors, and we can kind of see that. We see in figure 9.16, that the most important thing to do as a father now is considered to be showing the child love and affection, versus taking care of the child financially. But then we can also see once again, just the number of fathers across racial groups that do things like, bathe, diaper, dress their children daily, play with their children daily, read to their children daily, ate meals with children daily, talk to children about their day daily. And obviously, this happens a little bit more when people live with their kids, but it's just worth noting, the number of fathers who still try to engage in some of these daily behaviors, even if they don't live with their children. And so we can really see that between 1965 and 2011, where we see kind of the greatest increase for men is the amount of time that they're spending on childcare in 2011 versus 1965. A little bit more increase in housework, a little decrease in paid work, but really a dramatic increase in the amount of time spent on childcare, and that goes along with that shifting attitudes. So that's the second article that I want you to read, "The Science of Dad and the Father Effect." I thought that was really interesting. The article describes being a good dad, and just kind of as you're reading the article, just relate it to your own evaluation of your own childhood experiences, or if you are a parent yourself, your own parenting experiences. Your book in this section also kind of makes some like more just some kind of random observation. I won't say random, some less developed observations, just kind of making a point that, in modern society, the growing number of parents struggling with opioid addiction has obviously had an impact on parenting. Parenting children who have health issues, particularly what Cohen calls invisible disabilities, has had an impact on parenting. And then protecting children from racism or violence, of course, has had an impact on parenting, particularly for parents of Black children. We return back to our discussion of same sex parents, now no longer in the context of just adoption. In 2019, the Census Bureau estimated there were about 200,000 children living with same sex couples. Um, Same-sex couples are still, though, much less likely to have children than different sex couples, just because they may face, legal obstacles to becoming parents, and they oftentimes have to address those legal obstacles because of the amount, the fact that their path to having children oftentimes brings in, additional institutions like the government or, the institution of medicine. Although, as I noted, they are increasingly pursuing adoption and foster care and assisted reproduction together as couples. And so, in light of that, the really short article that just kind of makes the point, about how increased acceptance around same-sex parenting has really kind of impacted um, the journey to pregnancy of same-sex couples. And so this is just a personal kind of narrative out of the New York Times entitled "An LGBTQ Pregnancy from DIY, Do It Yourself, to IVF." So real short read. This is just a quick slide that I added. I normally, I teach this in person, I normally do this as like a group activity, and we talk about the different issues and challenges that parents face over the life course. Because once a parent, always a parent until the day you die, and or your child dies. You're always a parent. So it's not just about parenting little children. So we talk about these different things, and so parenting infants and babies, the obviously issues around crying and fatigue and stress. One kind of controversial issue that comes up is co-sleeping. Like, where does your child sleep? In their own room, in your room, but in their own bed, or in fact in your bed. Then parenting children, what is kind of the quality of your daily interactions, and how does that impact who your children grow up to be? Certainly that is something that is of interest of researchers, is how much of children's temperament is based upon genetics versus socialization. And so this comes up with, the big five personality traits are oftentimes considered to have very strong kind of genetic biological underpinnings. But think about all the other personality traits that you don't kind of see represented there. A lot of those seem to be more related to socialization. What role does self-esteem, how do parents and their interactions with children impact their self-esteem? Two kind of controversies that kind of come up at this stage of the life course is, of course, medicalization. The number of children that are on pharmaceuticals for everything related to ADHD, to like anxiety, that it has raised alarm in some circles about whether children are too medicalized. There's also been some pushback against the concerted cultivation model, where people are saying children are becoming overprogrammed, that they don't have enough free time and time for free play. Because instead their days are overscheduled and overprogrammed. And then what about when they become teenagers? There's concerns are obviously around, hormones and how you address that. And two terms that often comes up, particularly when you're looking at like how people parent teenagers, is, are you a helicopter parent? Which you're constantly hovering, or I think your textbook mentions like a snowplow parent, where you're basically trying to plow obstacles out of your child's way to make their lives overly easy. Or are you what's called a problem parent, meaning because of either your lack of involvement, or maybe your too strict discipline, or parenting style, you are basically creating a problem. You're a problem yourself. And then at some point your children become adults. But certainly the millennials, my generation, we've been called the boomerang generation because our parents threw us away. They sent us off to school, and because of life, a lot of us have wound up back in their homes. We graduated into economic instability, haven't had as much, strong economy to get kind of solid footing. Well, we have lower rates of home ownership than previous generations. So a lot of us find ourselves back in our parents' home. And then parenting in later life. Um, So some parents continue to parent even as their children approach middle age themselves. And a lot of that has to do with the changing role of grandparents. And that's because grandparents, are can take on multiple forms. So one way is that grandparents can be actual custodial grandparents. And so we've certainly seen this once again, as we've had this opioid epidemic. A custodial grandparent is a grandparent who basically has custodial rights, parental rights of their grandchild. They are their grandchild's primary parent. That the child lives with them, usually without the parent, and the grandparent is doing all of the kind of parenting duties. But what has also become very common, even before the pandemic, is living with grandparents. So these are grandparents who either move into their children's home, or what has become even more common, children move back into their parents' home with their own children. And like I said, a lot of that has to relate to macro sociological forces, dealing with the economy. And so this results in those multi-generational families, in one household, that we've talked about, being more common, in the last few decades than than what they were previous. And then finally, they're daycare parents. So because we do not provide publicly funded daycare in most cities and states, and daycare is instead provided by the market and thus can be very expensive. What you also have are grandparents who take care of their grandchildren in lieu of their grandchildren going to, daycare. One kind of issue that comes up with grandparents, especially as they're taking on this kind of increased role, is what rights do they have to grandchildren? And you might be surprised, but there aren't a lot of established grandparent rights. And so, especially as like Americans have kind of moved into this trend where, it's not, I do until death do us part. It's kind of become I do until we get a divorce. This has raised some real issues and challenges about what rights do grandparents have to grandchildren post divorce, and the answer is not many. So I gave you an article from the U.S. News, basically about the number of U.S. grandparents who are raising millions of kids, and they talk about some of the disadvantages and troubles that go along with this, and those certainly do exist. But I also encourage you to think about maybe are there some advantages, or benefits to this as well. And then, like I said, because I kind of did these two sections out of order, the final section that I'm going to discuss in this video is 9.4, children's living arrangements. And so your book just makes the point, we care about who children live with because it impacts their socialization, it impacts their health, it impacts their security. So this is why we study this. And when we study, and based upon, our empirical kind of data, that we've collected about family structure and marriage patterns over the last half century, um, there are several observations Cohen makes about family structure. Living arrangements have become more diverse, and the scale of family transformation is marked by inequality. So there are certain groups that have seen like a shift towards single mother families, much more so than other groups. And that a lot of these shifts and changes have also kind of resulted in social change. In specifically, they talked about, there's been this increased cultural acceptance of family structures beyond the breadwinner homemaker form, because so many more people live in those, so many less people live in that type of family than 50, 60 years ago. One thing about the kind of increased diversity in family forms is it can come with um, a greater number of family transitions. And that's because, children can have their relationships with adults change in. With remarriage, they might have to adjust to new parenting standards. If there's remarriage and there are other children, step siblings, they have their lives become intertwined with those other children. And just in general, whenever you're talking about divorce, remarriages, all of this has an economic component. So these types of transitions can have and do have long lasting effects on children. They add stress. And so, all of this is just stuff that for people who study family structure, this is something that they keep in mind, that these types of individual decisions people make about divorce, about remarriage, about building, a blending a family together. This also plays out in the lives of children as well, and this is something that is of sociological interest. So this final kind of graph just kind of shows, um, that in addition to the transitions and changes related to divorce and remarriage, another kind of important transition and change related to family structure has been the increase in household composition that includes those extended family members. So, like I discussed, it's you know, uh, a growing number of children are living in the home of a grandparent. And so that is becoming more and more a common experience people are having growing up in today's society. And so, although I is slightly out of order, everything from your textbook here was covered. Thank you for sticking with a pretty lengthy video. And that is all.